Somewhere around 1930, a tenant-farming family in the Deep South could feed 6 people 3 meals a day on less than $2 a week, corn, pork fat, and molasses, doing almost all of the work. That figure comes from USDA cost of living surveys of the period, and it holds up across state lines. Extension Service bulletins from the same years kept landing on the same conclusion. Diets built around dried peas, cornmeal, and slow-cooked greens held up nutritionally better than anyone expected from food that cost almost nothing. Federal Writers Project interviews from the 1930s described kitchens where nothing sat idle, pork fat, pot liquor, stale bread, all used before it could be wasted. Number 9 on this list was sold hot off push carts in southern cities until public health ordinances made street food harder to sustain, and it disappeared almost overnight. Number 1 didn't vanish because anyone forgot how to make it. It vanished because families started buying something else on purpose. If you've ever stretched a paycheck further than it should go, cooked for a table that used to be fuller, or gone looking for a recipe your grandmother never wrote down, this list is for you. Subscribe if you want the rest of these dishes traced the same way. Sourced, not guessed at. Let's start at 19. Number 19. Ash cakes solved a problem that had nothing to do with taste. How do you bake bread when there's no oven, no kitchen, and no time to leave the field? The method used almost nothing. Cornmeal, salt, water, sometimes a spoon of pork grease. The dough went stiff, got wrapped in wet corn husks or pressed straight into the coals, and baked in the ash and embers of a fire that was already burning for another reason. No pan, no second fuel cost. Extension bulletins price cornmeal as one of the cheapest staples a household could buy, stretching a few cents across a week of meals. And that mattered because field labor in the cotton and tobacco belt didn't pause for a stove. A worker could bury a cake in the coals at sunrise and dig out bread by the time hunger caught up with them. The outside came out blackened, faintly bitter from the ash. The inside stayed dense and smoky. A fire was often kept going through the day anyway, so ash cakes rode along on that same flame at no extra labor. When families moved north into apartments with gas ranges and no yard to build a fire in, the method had nowhere left to happen. It wasn't replaced. It was made impossible. Number 18. Scrapple and head cheese weren't breakfast food first. They were an answer to a hard rule. Nothing from the animal goes in the ground. After a hog was slaughtered, the scraps too small or too odd for anything else, trimmings, head meat, organ pieces, got simmered down, mixed with cornmeal and seasoning, and set into a loaf that could be sliced and fried later. Head cheese did the same work with connective tissue and gelatin, set cold into a dense tureen. A single hog, properly used this way, could feed a family meat for weeks past the slaughter date, at a time when a whole animal represented one of the largest single investments a rural household made in a year. This was less a recipe than a discipline. Waste was a cost sharecropping families could not absorb. The smell alone told you what was cooking: rendered fat, black pepper, sage, something faintly organ-rich underneath. Home hog killing was a shared seasonal event, and these dishes were the proof that nothing had been thrown away. In northern cities, without a hog to slaughter or a smokehouse to render fat in, the entire practice had no raw material left to work with, and the habits attached to it faded within a generation. Number 17. Molasses pie was built for a kitchen with almost no ingredients on hand: flour, molasses, eggs if there were any, and a crust that had to do a lot of work with very little filling. It set into a dense, custard-like center under a top that caramelized dark and slightly bitter. One pie, cut thin, could serve a family for several nights, which mattered when sugar was one of the few store-bought goods a tenant household budgeted for at all. Molasses ran cheaper than refined sugar and did double duty as a sweetener across an entire week of cooking. Not just one dessert, a practical choice as much as a flavor one. The smell filled a kitchen before the pie ever left the oven, thick and slightly smoky, closer to burnt sugar than anything fruity. Rural cooks passed the technique down by watching, not measuring. As store-bought pies became available and affordable in northern grocery stores, a pie that announced its own poverty on the plate had little reason to survive the move. Number 16. Pone bread with cracklins took the byproduct of hog rendering and turned it into the best part of the bread. Cracklins, the crisp, fat-rich bits left over after lard was rendered down, got folded straight into cornmeal batter before it baked, so nothing from the process went to waste. This wasn't an extra step for flavor. It was the natural next move after rendering, using fat solids a family had already paid for with the whole animal. A single hog's rendering session could season weeks of cornbread this way, at no added cost. The smell was sharp and porky, cutting through the plainness of cornmeal underneath. Rendering lard at home was tied directly to the same seasonal hog killing that produced scrapple and head cheese. Once families left home meat processing behind for city grocery stores, there was no rendering happening in the kitchen anymore. The bread that remained was just bread. Number 15. Pot liquor was the liquid left behind after a pot of collard, turnip, or mustard greens finished cooking down, and rural cooks understood something about it that got lost later. The water had absorbed most of what made the greens worth eating in the first place. It got ladled over cornbread, sipped on its own, saved and reused as a base for the next pot. In households where meat was scarce, pot liquor functioned as a meal on its own, a way to draw a second use out of a pot already paid for once. Its smell was earthy, almost mineral, with a smoky undertone if pork fat had gone into the greens. Extension Service pamphlets specifically noted the nutritional density of liquids like this, a detail that ran counter to how casually it got poured down the drain elsewhere in the country. The habit required greens cooked slowly at home in a watch pot, not vegetables arriving pre-washed and pre-cut from a store shelf, already stripped of the time that made the liquid worth saving. There's a pattern by now, 6 dishes in, and it isn't really about the food. Cornmeal and hog fat and burnt sugar weren't the point. They were what got a family from one week to the next when there wasn't a second option sitting on a shelf somewhere. This wasn't cheap eating. This was how people made it through alone. Number 14. Chitlins casserole took cleaned hog intestines, slow-cooked them down with onion, pepper, and whatever herbs were on hand, turning a part of the animal most households had no other use for into a full dish. The labor was part of why it mattered. Long, careful cleaning, then a slow simmer to break down the texture into something tender, feeding a household through the leanest stretch after a hog killing. The smell was strong and unmistakable, filling a house for hours. After the migration north, chitlins increasingly got tied in public conversation to a painful history, a food born of necessity during slavery. And rather than reclaim that history at the table, many families simply stopped cooking it. Number 13. Hoe cakes were cooked in the field, on a metal hoe blade heated over an open fire. Batter poured straight onto tool steel instead of a pan. Cornmeal, water, salt, sometimes a little fat. Fried until the edges browned and crisped. The setup cost nothing beyond a tool a field worker already carried, and a batch could be made and eaten inside a single break in the workday. The smell was sharp cornmeal and hot fat, close to popcorn, but heavier. Extension bulletins describe this kind of field cooking as routine, not improvised. Northern apartments had no fields, no hoes, no fire between shifts. Pancake mixes filled the morning slot instead, and the specific skill had nowhere left to be taught. Number 12. Sorghum molasses sweetened almost everything in a rural southern kitchen before refined sugar became affordable. Biscuits, cakes, candy, even coffee. Sorghum cane was grown, pressed, and boiled down locally. keeping the cost lower than shipped-in sugar and putting sweetening within reach of households with almost no cash income. The taste was darker and more mineral than sugar, closer to something burnt than sweet. USDA data consistently lists sorghum among the cheaper sweeteners of the era. As industrial sugar refining expanded and prices dropped, sorghum lost its cost advantage, and a generation raised in northern cities never tasted the difference. Number 11. Squirrel and rabbit stew came from what a family could catch, not what they could buy. Small game, trapped or shot close to home, slow simmered with whatever root vegetables were in season. It took almost no cash outlay, only time and knowledge of the land, supplying protein on a schedule the family controlled, rather than one set by a paycheck. Federal Writers Project interviews describe small game hunting as routine, not a special occasion. When families moved into city apartments, there was no land to hunt on, no reason to keep the skill sharp. Number 10. Sweet potato pone. Sat somewhere between a pudding and a cake. Baked slow in cast iron until it set dense and custard thick. Grated sweet potato, a little sugar or molasses, milk, spice if available. The method depended on a cook knowing by smell and color when it was done. Sweet potatoes stored well through winter without refrigeration, making this a dish available even in the leanest months. Pre-made crusts and canned filling later offered a shortcut, but the slow patience the original required didn't survive the trade. From here, the list moves faster. 9 dishes disappeared for reasons that mostly repeat. A vending economy that got regulated out of existence, a fridge that made preservation dishes pointless, cuts of meat people stopped wanting to look at, and a country that started rewarding convenience over patience. Number 9. One of tonight's teased items. Black-eyed pea fritters were sold hot off carts on southern city streets and made at home for gatherings. Mashed peas, seasoning, and a hot pan doing all the work, fried until the outside crisp gold. They cost almost nothing to make, a pot of dried peas stretching into dozens of fritters. And they gave street vendors a way to earn cash income from a staple that would otherwise sit in a sack in the kitchen. The smell was hot oil and something faintly nutty underneath it. As cities tightened licensing and health rules around pushcart food, through the early 20th century, that vending economy shrank fast, and a food that had lived mostly outside a formal kitchen had nowhere left to be sold. Number 8. Okra soup thickened a pot the way flour never could, and it did it using a vegetable that grew easily in southern gardens with almost no cultivation cost. Sliced okra released a natural starch as it cooked down with tomato, onion, and whatever meat scraps were on hand, turning a thin broth into something substantial enough to be a meal. It cost pennies to make and used a crop that produced heavily through late summer, exactly when other vegetables were thinning out. The texture, that release of natural gel as it simmers, became, over time, something people described with the word slimy, more often than they described it as useful. Gumbo, built on the same base, survived because it got reframed as a celebrated regional dish elsewhere. Okra soup, tied more plainly to rural southern poverty, didn't get the same reframing, and it faded out of northern kitchens that had no reason to defend it. 12 dishes in, and it's worth saying plainly, this stopped being about money a while ago. Fritters sold from a cart, a soup thickened with a garden vegetable, a stew built from what a trap caught. None of that was about being frugal for its own sake. It was about refusing to go without. Number 7. Corn pone served with fish roe paired the cheapest bread available with a protein most people threw away. The eggs of river catfish and other freshwater fish, salted, pan-fried, and eaten alongside cornbread still warm from the pan. For families near rivers and creeks across the South, fishing supplemented a diet otherwise built on cornmeal and pork fat, and roe was part of the catch that cost nothing extra to use. The smell was mineral and slightly briny, unlike anything else served at the same table. As families moved to northern cities without rivers nearby and gained access to meat cuts considered more desirable, roe became something few people wanted to admit they'd once relied on, and a combination that had once been ordinary quietly disappeared from the plate. Number 6. Hush puppies started as daily bread, not a restaurant side. Fried cornmeal batter, seasoned with whatever was on hand, made fresh with oil already hot on the stove. Getting the oil temperature and shaping right took the kind of repetition that comes from making the same food most days of the week. As frozen, pre-made versions became standard at restaurants, the daily home ritual behind them was already gone. Number 5. Souse took the least desirable cuts of pork, feet, ears, other trimmings, and set them, boiled and gelatinized, into a firm loaf that sliced clean and kept without refrigeration for days. That last part mattered most. In households without an ice box, a preserved, self-contained dish like this extended the usable life of meat that would otherwise spoil fast in southern heat. It cost almost nothing beyond the animal already slaughtered, and it asked for patience rather than cash. Sliced cold, it had a firm, slightly bouncy texture, mild and porky rather than strong. Once refrigeration became standard in northern homes, the entire reason for souse to exist, preservation without a fridge, stopped applying, and deli meat offered the same convenience with none of the labor or the association people were trying to leave behind. Number 4. Biscuits and red-eye gravy were built around two things. A household usually had flour with lard cut in and the drippings left in a skillet after ham was fried. Coffee, sometimes water, deglazed the pan into a thin, dark gravy that used every bit of fat and brown bits, nothing wasted. Making the biscuits took daily practice at a specific stove, muscle memory that didn't transfer to a new kitchen. Instant mixes and canned gravy offered the same meal faster, and a ritual that once defined a household's morning quietly gave way to convenience. This was never shame. It was dignity. People refusing to waste any part of what they had, right down to the drippings in a pan. Number 3. Pig's feet stew simmered trotters for hours until the connective tissue broke down into a rich, gelatin-heavy broth, thick enough to coat a spoon. The cut cost next to nothing. Feet had little value elsewhere on the animal, which made this one of the most affordable ways to get real body and richness into a pot. Root vegetables, whatever was in season, went in alongside for bulk. The smell was deep and savory, closer to bone broth left to reduce for a full day than anything quick. Rural cooks understood this as a way of extracting maximum nutrition from a cut most kitchens ignored, long before collagen was a word anyone used at a dinner table. As northern households gained easier access to boneless, trimmed cuts of meat, the visual of a whole foot in a bowl became something families increasingly avoided serving to guests, and the dish retreated from company tables first, then from family ones. Number 2. Traditional succotash was lima beans, corn, and salt. Nothing else, slow cooked together until the flavors settled into each other. Both crops grew easily and cheaply across much of the rural South, and the dish required no meat, no dairy, no ingredient. A household didn't already have on hand from its own garden. That simplicity was the entire point. A full, filling side built from 2 vegetables and thyme. Its smell was plain and starchy, corn sweetness under a earthier bean base. As taste shifted toward more elaborate, garnished versions of regional dishes, or toward food that photographed well, a dish built entirely on restraint had little to offer that kind of presentation, and many families simply let it drop rather than defend how little it needed to be good. Number 1. Root vegetable bread, beets, carrots, parsnips, grated fine and baked into a dark, dense loaf, used produce a southern garden could reliably produce even in a poor season, stretching what little flour a household had into something that held together and lasted. It tied a household directly to the land it worked, tasting like whatever the ground had actually produced that year. After the Great Migration, as store-bought white bread became affordable in northern grocery stores, families increasingly chose it, not because they'd lost access to root vegetables, but because store bread signaled where a family had arrived and what they no longer had to grow to eat. None of these 19 dishes were really about the recipe. They were about a family finding a way through a week with almost nothing to spend, wasting nothing they had. The currency running these kitchens wasn't money. It was memory, passed down by watching instead of reading, and necessity, which taught people exactly how far a sack of cornmeal or a hog's worth of scraps could stretch. Some of what's lost is just technique. Some of it is a story families chose to leave behind on purpose. If one of these dishes belongs to your own family's history, try making it this week slowly and eat it the way it was meant to be eaten, without apology.